Breaking this morning, the Republican White House has a new warning for Republican senators. Get behind all of Trump's cabinet picks or face political consequences. Senior White House official telling NBC News, quote, "It's pass-fail. You either support everyone or you don't. The Senate needs to advise and consent, not advise and adjust." The threat comes as three of Trump's most controversial cabinet picks prepare to face the Senate this week. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will testify this Wednesday and Thursday. He'll have to explain his embrace of vaccine conspiracies as he seeks the nation's top health role. Joining us now, Democratic Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware. She sits on the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, one of two committees questioning Kennedy this week.
Yes. Senator, before we get into RFK Jr. and this hearing, the members of in the House, the ranking members, they all sent a letter to the president registering what they call their grave concern about his recent attempt to unlawfully, arbitrarily remove more than a dozen independent, nonpartisan inspectors general. Just your reaction to the news that the president late Friday night fired 18 inspectors general without the 30-day notice.
You know, I think that this is just representative of his administration. I mean, it has literally been not even a whole week. And for some people, it may feel like a year. The fear that it is, I think, intended to instill, you know, whether you are a federal employee, just trying to do your job. I've had people call me who work for the VA. Like, if we say we support veterans, this is how you treat the people who are working with veterans. The fear of whether you are an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. I had someone say to me yesterday, a young woman who is scared. She said, "I was born here. I don't even know Belize. I've never been there." And so part of this intention is fear, but some of it is really to, you know, get at some of the systematic issues that have been really safeguarding people. And I think that's why these nominations are so important as well, because we're talking about our health, our safety, our national security. And so, you know, for the House to send that letter, I think is appropriate. But this is going to be a moment where it is literally all hands on deck. I am so grateful to be in the Senate at this moment. I'm grateful to be in a position where we can ask the question of these nominees and put things on the record for the American people. Because, you know, instead of dealing with the issues that people say they care about, he's focusing on things that are going to, again, instill fear, really try to maybe enrich his friends and create just more power.
From my perspective, Senator, the three nominees up this week are wholly unqualified. We wouldn't get the hex at that. That's just a brain fart on its own. But the reality that we have now in front of us is someone who is a threat to our national security in Tulsi Gabbard, someone who's a threat to our homeland security in Kash Patel, and someone who's a threat to our health in RFK Jr. There's no question at this point that if I were a senator, I would ask them. I'd do one thing. I'd block every last one of them. I would not let it. I would tell. I mean, the White House is saying, "Oh, you Republicans, y'all don't get to advise and consent, advise and adjust." That advise and consent basically is, you know, you do what we tell you to do. That's not your problem. You're in the minority, and with a very thin majority on the other side. What are Democrats prepared to do to make the point that these three individuals is a line that they are drawing on behalf of the country, that this administration is going to have to come back to the table with somebody else? Because, I mean, you already saw what your boy from West Virginia did to Democrats for 18 months. I don't understand why you can't do the same to Republicans.
Well, you know, for me, Michael, this is not even a partisan issue. The reality is we have a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility to advise and consent. And so when you don't get background checks on people, you know, when you don't get the information before you have a hearing or meet them, that first of all says we got an issue.
Right.
When I look at these individuals, I'm looking at your ability. Can you do the job? I'm looking at your experience. Have you ever managed anything? Do you know what mifepristone is if you're trying to be the secretary of HHS? And what is your character? Again, I've been blessed to serve in Delaware as under 2 governors, and I've gone through the cabinet process. And, you know, I'm also looking at, and I've asked on some of these individuals on my one-on-one meetings, if the president is saying or doing something or proposing something that you think is bad for this country, will you speak up?
What's their answer?
Some have said, oh, yes, I will speak up.
They
I will
lying.
follow the law.
They lying.
You know, this is
lying.
but I got to ask the question.
I know.
I know Alicia has a question. I just want to real quick. So did you meet with RFK Jr.?
I have.
They
yes.
made him available to you. How was the meeting?
The meeting was very interesting. I had concerns going in.
Why was it interesting?
I had concerns going in, and I have more concerns, and I'm looking forward to this hearing. You know, for me, I was, in addition to the issue of vaccines, which so many people have talked about, and we know the danger of this, you know, not being able to really, first of all, just putting out misinformation and disinformation and possibly profiting from it. That's a problem. I asked questions about reproductive freedom. You know, I've heard that he was pro-choice, and I've heard he is now whatever Donald Trump says. And so I wanted to get some clarity on that. Some of these things will come up in the hearing this week that you will hear. And then I wanted to know, what do you know about this department? It is the largest, you know, one of the most biggest budgets in the federal government. And I was Deputy Secretary of Health and Social Services in Delaware, as well as Secretary of Labor. So again, you know, I recognize that you're going to have to manage. And ultimately, it is about our public health, our safety, and also making sure that we lower costs. So I also asked about the prescription drug negotiations. Are we going to continue on with that? And are there going to be more opportunities to lower costs for the American people? So it'll be an interesting hearing this week. I will tell you that.
Let's talk about where his stance on vaccines and cost for consumers might actually intersect. This is from Politico. The more far-reaching options that Kennedy has discussed with allies include disbanding the main panel of experts that advises the government on vaccines, evaluates their safety, and recommends which vaccines should be routinely administered to children and adults. And this is the part that I want to underline and talk about. Its decisions can also affect whether public and private insurers cover the shot's cost for patients. I mean, there's the reality for our communities and our children if these vaccinations are not available. There's also the reality for folks like myself. I'm still going to vaccinate my kids. The difference is my insurer now may choose not to cover it.
You know, there are a couple of things there. First of all, the issue of your insurer not choosing to cover it, which, again, is a problem. And there are also vaccines for children program that we need to make sure that our kids are safe when they go to school. And then all of the hard work that we as Democrats put in to make sure that seniors could get vaccines for free. And so, again, it isn't just how he believes, it's how it will be implemented and show up for us. And then there's the other issue of the scientists. You know, someone can say, I believe in science, but if they believe in a science from some unfounded conspiratorial scientists who don't even have a background in science, then that's another problem. And so for us, I think this hearing is going to be a very interesting one. Senator Bernie Sanders actually convened a panel of experts to talk to our Democratic caucus members about vaccines and about the efficacy and about how we need to be looking at this nominee.
There's science and then there's science fiction. So.
Oh, I love that. There's science and then there's science fiction.
There we are.
Yeah.
Senator Lisa Blunt Rochester, thank you so much for being with us.
Perhaps no image so powerfully encapsulates the nascent 47th presidency of the United States. Rows of seated billionaires, the wealthiest incoming cabinet in U.S. history, formally ushered into power. The combined personal worth, not the market value of the stock of the companies they lead. I'm talking about the actual personal net worth of the billionaires seen in this image is estimated to be nearly $1 trillion, according to Forbes. The message seems to be, welcome to the new American oligarchy. This billionaire flex is a stark and damning illustration of the role that extreme wealth plays in Donald Trump's orbit. But understanding how we got here and how to rise from it requires us to zoom out from this image and this moment. President Trump is the inevitable outcome of forces that were set in motion some 50 years ago, maybe even longer. His ascendancy marks the apex of laissez-faire economics, a philosophy that argues for minimal government intervention in the economy, what we think of as the free and largely unregulated market system. That, combined with pivotal Supreme Court rulings that lifted sensible restraints on corporate political spending. Together, these forces set America on a path toward oligarchy. Trump recognized the brokenness of our system and then moved in to capitalize on it. Investopedia defines an oligarch as a person of a, quote, ruling class of individuals who amassed great wealth or status and who exert power over the highest government circles. Starting in 1976, the Supreme Court's landmark decision in the campaign finance case Buckley v. Valeo unleashed a torrent of political spending by wealthy individuals. In that case, the High Court determined that limits on election spending were unconstitutional, opening the door for the ultra-rich to spend as much as they want on their own campaigns. 34 years later, the Supreme Court would go one step further in Citizens United, granting corporations First Amendment rights, meaning that their political spending was protected as a form of free speech, essentially opening the door to unlimited election spending. With a single ruling, the Supreme Court dismantled over a century of federal restrictions designed to shield our political systems from the corrupting influence of extreme wealth. The damage to our democratic institutions cannot be overstated. Dark money flooded our politics. Politicians became more beholden than they had been to moneyed interests than to their voters. A handful of unelected judges essentially gutted the fundamental principle of one person, one vote, forcing your individual vote to compete against billions of dollars from industries whose interests often conflict with those of the working and middle class. Meanwhile, a new economic philosophy emerged in the 1980s, one that prioritized free and unregulated markets, a seismic shift that would usher in historic levels of inequality. Deregulation across multiple administrations brought prosperity to the wealthiest, while the rest of America experienced stagnant or even declining incomes when you account for inflation. And that brings us to today. Today, just a tiny sliver of the country controls the overwhelming majority of wealth in this nation. According to a Congressional Budget Office report from October, the country's top 10% maintains a majority of the wealth in the United States. The top 1% controls nearly a third of it. What effect does control of the moneyed class over politics have on us? Well, today, the word care in American healthcare has been stripped of all compassion, with insurance companies routinely putting profits over people. According to an FTC report from last week, some of the nation's largest health insurance companies profited from prescription price hikes of 1,000% or more. Today, health insurers interrupt doctors in the middle of surgery to question their patients' coverage, as a Texas physician detailed in an Instagram video earlier this month. Today, so-called food barons dominate our food industry, where just a handful of mega corporations control every link of the food supply chain, as an investigation by The Guardian and Food and Water Watch revealed in 2021. Today, a monopoly of home builders is worsening the housing shortage in the United States, pushing home ownership further out of reach for the average American. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, tackling America's housing crisis will require taking on these monopolies. Decades of laissez-faire policies have completely shattered the American dream for the nation's working and middle class. Oxfam America puts it bluntly. Today, the top 0.01% and giant corporations have rigged the rules so drastically that some billionaires end up paying 0% in taxes, nothing. Instead, working families are bearing more than their fair share of the tax burden. As a result of all of this, 46% of America's middle class say they have no choice but to scale back or suspend their retirement plans, according to a Primerica report, and now need to rely on staying healthy enough to work more years than they had initially planned. Those economic forces, combined with key Supreme Court rulings, have collectively laid the groundwork for the seismic shift in power that we are witnessing today. Notably, today's equivalent of the robber barons not only control vast streams of wealth and production, but also the flow of information, possibly making them an even greater threat to our democratic institutions and public welfare. The tech industrial complex, as Biden called it, now seems to function as an unofficial propaganda arm of the Trump administration, cloaking its actions in the language of economic populism and even democratic rights, as the oligarchy prepares to strip America for its parts. Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, frames crucial and much-needed regulation of the tech industry as an infringement of the constitutional right to free speech. As our nation enters this new chapter, we at Velshi remain committed to providing you with clarity amid the smokescreens of deception and holding to account the tech industrial complex that now occupies the halls of American power. We will closely track these threats to our democratic institutions and to America's working and middle class, these threats to you and your livelihood and your prosperity, and we will hold those who are using their economic power to undermine yours to account. Everybody uses the word oligarchy now, but what we are seeing is its manifestation. We are seeing the ways in which the powerful make decisions without shame that influence policies that affect the prosperity of the average American.
Absolutely. The book was published 4 years ago, by the way, and not much has changed. It's gotten worse. What's interesting, Ali, is that starting in 71 with the Powell memo, which really kicked this off, and then, of course, the Reagan Revolution. But, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court in 86 ruling that money isn't actually money, it's actually speech, and therefore it's protected by the First Amendment when it's given to politicians. And then Lewis Powell himself, 2 years later in 78, authoring the Bellotti decision. That was an entirely Republican appointee decision, as was Citizens United. I think it's important to note that these are entirely Republican efforts, that the consequence of all this has been that the Democratic Party has been focusing on elections. They've been focusing on Congress and the White House. And the Republican Party has been focusing on the courts and on the media, buying up media like there's no tomorrow, and packing the courts, realizing that if you control the courts and the media, you can control the elections, and then thus the elected bodies. And that's pretty much where we are right now. This is the second time we've seen this in America. The first time was in the period from the 1830s to the 1860s in the Old South, where a group of plantation owners, as a result of a technological innovation, the kind of the tech bros of their time, started using this device called a cotton gin. Eli Whitney had invented in 1789. And it could do the work of 50 people. And so a small number of very large plantations were able to just wipe out all of their competitors over this 20, 30-year period, and ended up ruling the South with an absolute iron fist, ending democracy, controlling the courts, and controlling all the newspapers. Any newspaper publisher who took them on could find himself hanged. And, we ended up fighting a civil war over that little brush with oligarchy.
We've gotten to an interesting place. The entrepreneur and venture capitalist and billionaire Nick Hanauer, who's a sort of an activist, has recently explained how the wealthy deploy propaganda to justify this consolidation of power. And he talks about a specific refrain that we've often heard from the corporate sector. He says, the one thing I've come up against so many times in my career working on economic policy is it's a job killer. How many times have you heard that? If you raise taxes on the rich, it'll kill jobs. If you regulate big corporations, it'll kill jobs. If you raise wages for working people, it'll kill jobs. We live in a world that is turned so upside down by this market fundamentalist framework that anything you propose that will improve the lives of middle class or working people has to affirmatively prove that it will do no harm. But anything good that happens to the truly rich is an unalloyed good. So infinite bonuses on Wall Street are a sign of economic growth and success, but a tiny increase in the minimum wage is a very dangerous job killer. I mean, that's become the reality of the discourse these days, Tom.
Yeah, and Nick is a good guy, in his participation with patriotic millionaires, but it's absolutely the case. And which another book I wrote, The Hidden History of American Monopoly. What we've seen since Reagan in 1983 essentially directed the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Justice to dial back on their enforcement of the antitrust laws. We had kind of during the Industrial Revolution, the 1870s, 80s, 90s, Senator Sherman of Ohio introduced the Sherman Antitrust Act and that was passed in 1881, as I recall. But it really didn't get enforced until Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. And you know, the consequence of Reagan and for all that time, from then until the Reagan Revolution, we were actually enforcing the antitrust laws. There were two other ones, the Clayton Antitrust Act in 27 and one in 56. And the result, and in fact, the Supreme Court in 1965 ruled that it was illegal for Buster Brown and Kinney Shoes to join because the resulting company would control 5% of the shoe market.
5%.
Today, just Nike controls 19%. Yeah. I mean, so what we're seeing is just this absolute seizure of American business by these giant monopolies. It's massive.
We're going to keep talking about this, Tom, because right now we had a hot minute where we were actually enforcing laws on the books, not bringing in new regulations, but doing what we said under the Biden administration. Lina Khan and the Federal Trade Commission gone now. And so whatever you didn't like that was going on in terms of consolidation, we're going to see more of in the next few years. But you and I will keep talking about it. Joining me now to discuss this is the Ambassador John Bolton. He served as one of President Trump's multiple national security advisors during his first administration. He also served as America's ambassador to the United Nations during the George W. Bush administration. He's the author of multiple books, including The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir, which President Trump cited as the reason to revoke Ambassador Bolton's security clearance. Ambassador, good to see you this morning. Thank you for being with us.
Glad to be with you.
Ambassador, I want to start with this issue about your book, the allegation that you published sensitive information. Just to be clear, when that happens, if that were to happen, if you published a book that had classified information without the approval or the clearance of the federal government and the CIA, they would absolutely have come after you. They've done that with other people. If you publish things you're not supposed to publish that are national secrets, they'll come for you. Tell me about this.
Well, the book went through a 4-month-long pre-publication review, which is typical for books by senior officials in the national security space. And at the end of it, the official who conducted the review had made a decision there was no classified information in the book and that the book could be published. Well, what Trump didn't like was not the classified information point, and you'll notice in that executive order it says sensitive information, not classified information, and it was sensitive because much of it was critical of him. So he tried to order another review to get the outcome he wanted. Now, let me just say, that throws the entire pre-publication review process into grave peril, because if it's manipulated by presidents for political purposes, that does threaten the First Amendment. But the book was cleared. There's no classified information in it. It was never my intent to disclose classified information. And in the almost 5 years now since the book did come out, I haven't heard anybody point to anything in it that was classified. This is Trump reflecting he just doesn't like to be criticized.
Yeah. One of the things that came up in the declassification, taking people's security clearances away, I remember having this conversation with the former CIA director, John Brennan. The argument was that you all use your security clearances for personal profit. Brennan made an interesting point to me once, and I want to know what you think about this. He said, I don't really use the security clearance for anything, but when the government needs to consult me about ongoing things, which they sometimes have to, they got to sometimes reach into the past and say, hey, Bolton, you were at the UN when X, Y, or Z happened. We want to talk to you about this. You need your security clearance in order to get the latest information. Talk to me about the relevance and or dangers of revoking security clearances of people who once had them.
Well, I think it's a mistake to revoke clearances for political purposes. In my case, I'm not even sure I have a valid security clearance anymore. I haven't since I've resigned in September of 2019, to my knowledge. I haven't had an update of my background investigation, for example, in 6 or more years. I can't even remember when the last one was. I don't think you need a security classification if you have had a senior role before. If the current administration determines that they want to talk to you. I'll give you an example. Remembering the famous Chinese balloon incident, the Chinese balloon that floated happily across the United States, a number of former Trump administration officials were called in individually to be given briefings on what the government knew about the Chinese balloon question. And I received one of them. And I signed a series of non-disclosure agreements that I wouldn't reveal classified information. That can be done at any time. And in normal administrations, signing that agreement's enough. Your word should be your bond after you've held high-level clearances to get it for a special purpose and then move on.
Talk to me about the reason we actually invited you on the show, and that's specifically about your own personal security. Donald Trump has removed your protection, that of Mike Pompeo and others who, with whom he disagrees either politically or with whatever you've done. Talk to me about this decision for you and how it affects future members of government who are going to be forced to make dangerous and personally perilous decisions on an ongoing basis.
Well, the president has the authority to designate Secret Service protection for individuals that he determines who are not necessarily part of the government. So do other agencies of the government. For example, in a case of a former Secretary of State or a current Secretary of State, that's provided by the Diplomatic Security Bureau at the State Department. But in my case, since I had been at the White House, Biden decided to provide Secret Service protection because of the threat level that the intelligence community was picking up from Iran for retaliation for the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, who is a dangerous terrorist responsible over many years for the deaths of hundreds of Americans, obviously ordered by President Trump, and he was at the top of the list of people being threatened. The concern about the threat level, in my case, which maybe was a little more advanced than some others, resulted in criminal charges being filed by the Justice Department against Shahman Poursafi, an official of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, for trying to hire a hitman to assassinate me. Now, the question of the threat level, and that's on the website of the Justice Department, or at least it used to be, the question of the threat level is something that's reviewed on a continuous basis. And in fact, just in the days before the inauguration, I was informed again that the threat level remained as it has been for several years. And I might say for viewers who don't know this process, neither I nor anybody else assessed as targets of the threat have anything whatever to do, no direction or control or influence at all over the determination of the threat. That's made purely by professionals in the intelligence community.
Ambassador, what you saw when Joe Biden sent that message to the Iranians, say you can't kill Donald Trump and you can't kill any other former or current U.S. officials, that would be an act of war. Do you believe that's true? And what would happen if that happened to you or one of these people who have been targeted? How should the U.S. react?
Well, in the case of everybody, it's not just me, but all of those who have been covered because of the Iranian threat since they left the government. It is the Iranians are after us for actions that were taken as part of our official government duties. Now, I mean, I don't believe anybody's entitled to anything from the government, but if you're going to allow people across the board really to be exposed to the seriousness of this threat without protection, it's an incentive for U.S. adversaries to take advantage of it. And so now, having read the news that the coverage has been lifted, there's no question in my mind, but that the actual possibility of them taking action is real. What should the U.S. do in response? The same thing it should do anyway, when Americans serving overseas, serving as in the military, serving in our embassies overseas are attacked, is to take action against those who perpetrated it. It's better, though, to try and deter the adversary from taking action in the first place, which the provision of protection hopefully does.
You and I have talked for years, Ambassador. We always appreciate you agree to come on the show. You and I don't actually agree on a whole lot of policy issues, but that's besides the point. That's the whole exercise of being in media. I do want to ask you, however, because you have a lot of experience in understanding what the Director of National Intelligence has to do. Tulsi Gabbard has her hearings this week. There are some deep and serious concerns. I don't know if they're enough for people for Republicans to vote against her, the advancement of her nomination. What's your sense of whether Tulsi Gabbard is qualified to be the Director of National Intelligence?
Well, she's not qualified in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I thought there were a trio of Trump nominations here that were really in a category by themselves, not just incompetent, but dangerous to the United States. One was Matt Gaetz. He's gone. The remaining two are Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel for the FBI. Not only are they not qualified, they have done things through the course of their career that show they don't have the judgment or the character, frankly, to hold such sensitive positions. I think this is a real danger for the United States in both cases. I think in Tulsi Gabbard's case, she said things and done things that show a lack of judgment that should keep her as far away from classified information as possible.
What's the danger on the Kash Patel side to you? Obviously, the Tulsi Gabbard side's got associations that we haven't cleared up with the former Syrian regime. It's got associations with the Putin regime and has some very strange foreign policy positions. What's your fear about Kash Patel, other than the fact that he's got an enemies list and thinks that the FBI should be used to be weaponized against the enemies of the current president?
Well, I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about it, which I'd refer people to for a longer take on it. But I think one of the dangers of many of the Trump nominations is that he's looking to be surrounded by yes men and yes women. He wants people who are going to tell him what he wants to hear and carry out his bidding without any question. There's no doubt the president makes the final decisions, but Trump will find he's not well served if he gets his wish and gets those kind of people. But particularly in a job like Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is something as part of a retribution campaign, if that's what Trump is about. It certainly seems that way, that makes it particularly dangerous. And I think it was very instructive that a few weeks ago, former Judge William Webster, who is the only person who's ever been both director of the FBI and director of the CIA, came out strongly against Patel getting that job. I hope people listen to Bill Webster. That's the kind of person with integrity. He came off the federal bench. He was a Republican appointee to the federal bench, but became FBI director under a Democrat. That's the sort of person you want leading the FBI, not Kash Patel.
Ambassador, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us this morning. Former Ambassador John Bolton, former National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration, author of the book, The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir.
Officer Michael Fanone is back with us. Officer Fanone, help me understand something. You spoke with our colleague Ryan Riley on Thursday. He reported that you spoke with victim services advocates at DOJ about trying to get restraining orders against some of these January 6 rioters who nearly killed you, as you just detailed. They refused to give you info on the assailants that would help you secure those restraining orders, telling you from the perspective of the new DOJ, quote, you are no longer a victim. How then are you supposed to protect your family if you don't have access to that vital information?
Yeah, I mean, it alleviates the possibility of obtaining protective orders. The way a protective order works is that, once you've applied for it, you're given a 2-week period. During that time, law enforcement has to make attempts to serve the individuals. Now, these guys were scattered like sticks to the wind when they were released from the Bureau of Prisons. And so, me being able to obtain that information on my own is virtually impossible. And so I looked to the Department of Justice, who, prior to Trump taking office, had considered me a victim for purposes of, these criminal prosecutions. And literally 9 a.m. The morning after Trump's inauguration, I was told that because the criminal convictions had been vacated and that, there was no pending cases, that I was not entitled to addresses or other pertinent information that I could use to obtain those protective orders. And so obtaining them now is an impossibility. I mean, really, to be honest with you, the only alternative I have is relocating myself and my family members and buying a gun.
Just let that sit.
Just let that sit. Like that is, and some might say, oh, well, that's not the only recourse you have. But to be clear, what are your other options except to relocate and to protect yourself?
Correct.
And the government, it seems, has left you out to dry. I wonder, have Democratic or not even Republicans, because I mean, Lindsey Graham was just on Meet the Press and he said he believes pardoning the most violent offenders from January 6th was a mistake. And it's like, thank you, Senator Graham. I wonder if he told the president. And like, thank you for about almost a week later weighing in here. Very important, which I think it's important that he said it, but like actions do speak louder than words. Have members of Congress reached out to you? Have people offered your support? Because I think for people to hear you say you feel like your only option is to relocate your family and buy a gun, that is the reality of your current situation. Who is reaching out to offer any additional assistance, if you will?
No one. I mean, all of my family is somebody's constituent, and no members of Congress have contacted me offering any type of support. No one in the government, no one in law enforcement. And when you talk about law enforcement, in the past, I always told my family members that they need to report these incidents. And unfortunately, law enforcement has just proven to be feckless in its ability to protect us, to do anything preemptively, and or dedicate any type of resources despite the level of threats, the viciousness and vile threats that we've received. They're completely indifferent. And so, my mother, myself included, have just stopped reporting it because there's nothing that they're going to do to protect us. We are on our own. It's up to us to protect ourselves.
Yeah, and that's just not how that should be. I mean, but this is the new landscape that Donald Trump's DOJ is going to have on these processes, where they'll just decide, well, you don't need that protection. Is what we were talking about with Director Brennan, just pulling his security clearances.
Yeah, no, I'm not alone in this.
Right, you're not.
There are hundreds of Americans who have done similar things to what I've done and spoken out. Who are experiencing the exact same level of threats and who have no protection other than to protect themselves.
The one little piece that out of all of these pardons, Pam Hemphill, who was a January 6th rioter, rejected Donald Trump's pardon, and on Katie Fang's show, she had this to say.
It would be a slap in the face to the Capitol Police officers, the rule of law, to our nation. I pleaded guilty because I was guilty. It would help their narrative that it was a peaceful protest that day. No, it was not a peaceful protest. It was an insurrection.
That little nugget of truth from someone who was there, who is holding on to her own accountability. We obviously wish more would do that and did that. But for me, at least, that's enough of an opening to continue to pursue the things that are important about what happened on January 6th, which is why what you're doing by being here, your voice, the voice of so many of your other fellow officers, many of whom were out this week, sort of reminding Americans about that. When you hear a J6 rioter say something like that, what do you think when you hear those words?
I mean, honestly, it has absolutely no effect on me. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, I'm an eternal pessimist. It's 1 out of 1,500 plus. Right. I appreciate the fact that there's someone out there in this group of convicted criminals that has some level of integrity and honor. That being said, there's many, many more who committed incredibly violent acts that day who are doing nothing other than celebrating these pardons. And it's serving to embolden not only them, but many others to commit more acts of violence in the future, knowing full well that Donald Trump will protect them and issue further pardons as long as the crimes are committed on his behalf.
Michael Fanone, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being with us.